Welcome back to the podcast tonight, where we're always talking politics, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, or to be honest, real estate. That's what we're talking about tonight. Real estate and all things related. For everything from the financing aspect of it, from the lending, insurance, the building, developing, you name it. We're going to have all kinds of different guests on, and we're talking about all things real estate, so you can learn some real inside scoop here on the podcast. So tonight, I'm excited again because we have our infamous lender back on again from Glendale, California at Primary Residential. He's been in the lending industry for I think 150 years, pretty close to that. We have back on again tonight, Mr. Dave D'Souza. Welcome back on the show, Dave.
Thank you very much.
All right, man. Glad to have you on. We're going to get back to Dave here a little bit later, and we're going to talk about what's going on with interest rates today, because there has been a few changes after the Fed had his chat the other day, and we're going to let you know exactly what happened with that if you don't know, and we're going to get into some details and some different perspectives and, what we think might happen futuristically with all of that. More importantly, though, I have a stud on tonight here. We've got George Avetisian on here out of Los Angeles. George is a developer designer, and he does some badass houses. I've been in his office. I've seen some of these renderings, and they're amazing. I thought he was building houses for Shaq and, half the Dodgers teams in there. I mean, it was amazing, some of these houses. We're super excited to have him on tonight because we're going to talk about some things and pick his brain a little bit about what's going on with LA and the rebuild of LA, because that's what's going on now. How are we going to get LA rebuilt? What's going on with the cleanup? What's going on with all this talk about permitting? Because that's going to be a nightmare, and this could hold up a lot of people. So we're going to have some great information on here tonight. We got George Avetisian on and Dave D'Souza. Let's get started. I'm going to introduce George. George, welcome to the show, pal.
Thank you for having me, Cash. Thank you.
Man, we're super excited. I know you're talking to us from your office tonight, right?
Correct.
Fantastic. George, how long have you been doing design and development?
Yeah, I've been in the design world since '99, since I graduated. Went out on my own in 2005. And as far as development, just recently in the last 2 years, started doing development myself.
Okay.
Along with partners on various projects. So it's a fun game. But it's definitely got its drawbacks. But I wouldn't have it any other way. It's an awesome thing to be doing.
Oh, that's awesome. And I could tell when I was in your office and just listening to you talk and about some of the projects you've done and are doing, you could see the passion in what you do, man. So that's absolutely awesome. I always love that 100%. So let's talk a little bit about these fires, because you're in it there. I mean, you're right there, boots on the ground, just like Dave is, and our insurance agent too, Zach, that he could not join us tonight, but he'll be back on next time. But boots on the ground, and we're getting a real inside perspective from what's happening out there. And, we're going to be able to share some things. Like you said, you went down to the Palisades to see what's going on down there. And it was like, you said, a war zone, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, they do have the military down there, and the military is actually like stopping people, checking IDs, making sure that you are the right person who you say you are. They have a lot of people who are claiming to be part of the press coming into the zones and actually being part of the theft ring that's kind of going on down there. But
wow.
The way that I was, of course, I could have gone and followed one of my clients into the actual zone, but I just decided to park outside the barricaded area where they're kind of like not allowing everybody to go in, and just went ahead and got in his car, and we just drove to the house that way. That was a lot easier.
Wow.
But
it's something else.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
They don't talk about that on the news so much. I haven't seen it. Have you, Dave? You seen any news about the military kind of personnel down there and all that?
I did actually see, they've got the police, not military, but I did see footage with the police. There may have been one or two shots with a couple of, people in fatigues, but mostly police. But I wouldn't doubt having the military there, because obviously this is, it was a very, very heavy situation. And unfortunately, a lot of people trying to take advantage of the situation when they shouldn't be.
That just gets me every time. People taking advantage of people's pain and suffering, right? Like, hey, here's an opportunity for me to steal some stuff. Looters on scooters. I heard that was happening all around LA. They're actually so lazy, they got to get on their scooter to go loot, Unbelievable. Amazing. Anyways, that's a whole nother story. But George, so I understand you have a couple clients in the Palisades. Is that right?
Correct.
Wow, that's big stuff right there. And what happened to their houses? And are these houses that you actually designed and developed as well?
There are a few that I designed and not necessarily developed, but I was on the design end of the actual scope.
Okay.
Um, the as far as the ones that I've seen so far, there was one on PCH right in Malibu that I'm working on right now. The other one is another fairly big project. Currently, well, it was about 5,700 square feet for a pretty famous person that we're going to be rebuilding because they love the design, and it's definitely challenging because I went through the Woolsey fire, right, the ones that happened in the Westlake, Thousand Oaks area,
Right.
and we they have to have a lot of steps that they have to take. So even this last time when I went and met with my potential clients on, I think it was Wednesday, um, the amount of paperwork that they actually have to complete in order to be able to get the process going, whether it's with the EPA, whether it's with FEMA, whether it's with their own insurance companies. There's a good amount of paperwork that's has to actually be completed in order for them to be able to come in, do the cleanup, prep the site. Yet they ask you certain questions, even as complicated, well, not complicated, but as simple as, hey, do you want us to actually remove the foundation off the property? If you have to remove the foundation off the property, of course, it's going to take longer. In the Woolsey
Sure.
fire, the longest that it took for one of the properties that we were working on took about 8 months. By the time the EPA came in, by the time FEMA came in, cleaned everything out, for us to be able to actually fully access the site, because there are contaminants, there are hazardous materials on
Right.
site, and for us to be able to actually get in there, do the survey, and start the design process.
Wow. Son of a 8 months just to start getting the debris cleaned out so you can start accessing the property, right?
Cash, if
Correct.
it's okay with
Unbelievable.
you, this is something we've discussed before, but since we have George as an expert, I had a quick question, which I'm sure a lot of our viewers and watchers might have is to be helpful information. George, from your
What do
perspective,
you got, Dave? We're all ears, buddy. What do you got?
if you've got somebody either that has had a total loss, or they know someone who has a total loss, from right now, obviously the first step is you got to clear the debris. Then after you clear the debris, then you got to get surveyed. Then you got to get designed. Then you got to get permits. Then you got to get the permits approved. And then you can actually start the construction, right? At some point. What would you
Right.
say would be
Correct.
a best case, not so much a worst case, but even in a best case scenario, like let's say either in the Palisades area or in the Altadena area, given the number of structures lost, what would you say would be a best case scenario from right now till when they could toast with champagne re-entering their home?
Good question,
Best
Dave.
case, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Dave, that's a great question. I was going to ask the same thing. So, George, what do you got, bud?
So best case scenario is probably going to be about a year and a half, meaning that you can actually start. Yeah, it's better than we can all kind of expect, for the simple reason that we can start off with the design. We don't necessarily have to have a survey unless we have a very sloped property that we have to have topographical surveys to be able to identify how the house is actually going to be situated up and down, whatever you want to call it. But majority of the properties that I've worked on in the Palisades were flat, even though some of them did have a view. They did have views of the ocean and things like that. But ultimately, majority of those properties are flat. So we can start the design process now, get to a point to where we're happy with where we're going with it. And by the time the cleanup is done, by the time the surveyors come in, we can actually even submit the plans without necessarily having the survey, and then marry the survey together with the rest of our site plan, the civil engineer site plan, and everything else for it to kind of work together. It's best
Okay,
case is a year and a half.
A year.
What do I feel it's going to be? It's probably going to be closer to two and a half years.
2.5,
Ultimately.
George. And that's up to the point, as Dave was saying, toasting the little champagne and moving into the
and I
house.
don't
Is
mean
that
to
right?
make light
Correct.
by
Yeah.
of what people have going through, but I when I talk about construction
No way.
from a financing perspective, I look at shovel to champagne, meaning when do you start the first shovel to when do you toast being back in the house, just so I understand, and so our listeners can understand what you're saying, because this is different than what I was told previously, so I appreciate the clarification. A survey is always required, but you don't necessarily have to wait for a survey in many cases to start the design process, or is there some cases where a survey is not required at all?
Well, let's say you have a rectangular lot in the flats of the West Los Angeles area. And let's say that that lot is 100 by 50, 5,000 square feet, and you know that it's an interior lot, and there's no corks in it. You know, it is exactly 50, it is exactly 100. For a lot like that, you're not technically going to need a survey unless you start doing a basement, unless you know that there's the property is raked in the opposite direction where it's actually going backwards towards the back of the property rather than the way it's supposed to go as far as like water on property going off onto the street. So in those cases where they're simple lots and simple dimensions, where it's not very critical on how the drainage is going to work or if you're going to have a basement or not. More than likely, no basement, drainage is working fine. So at that point, you don't necessarily need a survey. Now, majority of the properties in the Palisades are gonna need a survey. Majority of the properties in the Eaton Canyon Fire with Altadena and Pasadena area, those are probably gonna need a survey because they are on properties that are raked, or they are on properties that are not your standard property size.
You're saying that you could possibly in some, maybe many of those cases, just for my clarification or our clarification, you can actually start the design process without necessarily needing the survey to be complete. Okay, got it. That's good clarification because that's different than what I was told previously. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Nice. And George, within surveying some of these properties down there, coastal properties, like in the Palisades or Malibu, and with the fires and then the rains coming afterwards, mudslides are a real issue, right? And then this is going to challenge the integrity of all the soil conditions. And I'm wondering, could there be a potential, like we start stepping into like a liquefaction kind of a possibility, or that could be there anyways in those areas, I understand, but where do things fall with that? And that's part of the importance of doing these surveys, yes?
It is. And part of it is the survey and part of it is the soils report. So the soils report would be more inclined to be able to show where water is relative to a liquefaction zone. Like we know here in the valley, majority of the valley is a liquefaction zone, which means anywhere between 2 to 3 feet below the ground, you have water, and that creates an unstable foundation, of course.
Right.
But in the areas where we have the wildfires, where we have the actual earth getting very saturated, it does create the possibility of having mudslides. So that's when it becomes very important to be able to have an actual soils report so you know what's happening with it, not necessarily what the city deems allowed for us to be able to have a soils report. So if a soils report is within 10 years, it's acceptable for the grading department to be able to accept it. But even today, when I'm talking to clients, I'm like, no, I think we should go ahead and get a revised soils report. We should get a rig out here. We should do samples. We should do labs on everything to be able to make sure that a lot can happen in 10 years. I mean,
yeah. Well, and we're in shaky California, right?
Yeah. I mean, the good thing is bedrock doesn't move that much. But like in some cases, what certain cities consider to be bedrock is not a good thing. Case in point, Burbank, Glendale, another area where I have a good amount of clients. We do a good amount of work. And when you start doing soils reports in those areas and you start taking samples and they're like, oh, this is bedrock, it's alluvium or whatever it is, right? It's like you can actually go up to the mountainside, you can actually pick up a piece and it crumbles in your hand. And you're just like, how is this considered bedrock? Because it is highly, it has a lot of clay in it. And that clay is dried over time. We are in a drought. We don't have necessarily much moisture in the water. It doesn't necessarily bond as well to itself. It falls apart the minute you touch it. It's extremely brittle.
So what you're saying is what might be classified as bedrock may not necessarily be as safe as people think it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
From what George is saying, that there's a fairly sizable amount of work that has to happen before you can actually start the shovel piece. Even if you're not waiting for a survey, which again, it sounds like from what he's describing, more of these properties are going to need surveys. But even if you don't need a survey, and George, you can comment on this. So you have to get plans, then you have to get the plans and the permits approved by the city. With 15,000 structures having been lost, what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a couple things that they've done with the city of LA, with the city of Malibu, and how they're kind of expecting to expedite everything, right? So we all kind of have already heard that the Coastal Commission, we don't have to get approval from Coastal Commission for the properties located in the Pacific Palisades.
That is big stuff right there, George. No
Yeah,
Coastal Commission? Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's single jurisdiction or dual jurisdiction, state, local level, whatever it may be, with the Coastal Commission, that's a huge, huge piece.
Huge.
I've gone through the Coastal Commission process several times, and they're very nice people. Don't get me wrong. I love the people there. It's just they are on their own timeline. They do take their time on how they actually execute everything. So the other thing is CEQA, right? The California Environmental Quality Act. A lot of environmentally sensitive zones relative to this whole disaster, that goes away too. So that's a whole other process within the clearances that we get after we've actually received our plan check corrections from the city.
Okay.
That we don't necessarily have to get approvals from. So this also kind of triggers a couple of other questions for me, because we also have what are called specific plan requirements, whether it's through Mulholland, whether it's through various areas in the West LA Palisades area, whether it's through some of their HOA requirements. We always hear about the Huntington and the Alphabet Streets and Pacific Palisades, and how certain areas there also have HOAs that we have to go through. I don't know necessarily what that's going to involve at the moment, but looks like it's going to be expedited through that as well.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's a big time saver right there. So as I'm hearing this, the Coastal Commission and the other environmental commission, being sped up or kind of even passed by is what it sounds like at this point, kind of like just put on reserve and hold. Maybe that points out the level of importance of these compared to something like, soil conditions and foundation and approval of all these things holds way more water than some of these environmental committees, would you say? Or, you probably don't want to say, but it just seems interesting anyways, that's happening that way. So, and I am glad that it is happening, cutting through a lot of red tape at the end of the day so we could get stuff done for these poor displaced people, right?
Exactly. And ultimately our goal is to be able to get people back into their houses as quickly as possible.
Right.
And the minute we introduce all these, I guess, what the interesting thing is, the minute you start thinking about it, you're like, well, if they're willing to waive that during a crisis like this, what is the overall relativity into its existence?
Exactly.
That's what I kind of ask.
Yeah.
Yes,
I'm with you.
Coastal Commission is important to where, in the same sense that the Mulholland specific plan corridor is important to where, when you're driving down Mulholland, they want to make sure that it is a scenic route. When you're driving down PCH, it is a scenic route.
Yeah.
And it stays that way, and it doesn't turn into like Honolulu or something like that, where all these huge skyscrapers right on the water, or whatever you want to call it.
Gotcha. Well, it didn't turn into Honolulu, but now it's turned into Maui. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right. So
that's a whole different thing.
That's a whole nother song and dance, another story there. We'll get into that another time, but I got you on that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, wow. Shovel to Champaign, and the thing before now, Shovel to Champaign, the time frame, that's from Ready Project. But what has to happen now after this disaster is that the debris removal, the toxicity cleanup, and all these things, and then getting into where you can start looking at the soil conditions, all that. So that's going to be what, George? What do you think? 10 months for just all that?
Well, from just hearing what's going on with the talks, they're saying that relative to what happened with the Woolsey fire, they're going to try to cut that timeline in half. Now, the overall damage that we had with the Woolsey fire was less than 10% of what we have with this one, right?
Less than 10, okay. Wow.
Less than 5%. So that means they got to get like you keep saying, you got to get the boots on the ground, and you got to get all these people, whether it's FEMA, whether it's the EPA, you got to get these people to be able to get to the sites, to be able to do the evaluation, to be able to get the debris off the property. And then, you know what the funny thing is, my daughter asked me this yesterday. She's like, well, where are they going to put all that? You know,
Your
where's
daughter's smart. That's a great question.
yeah, exactly. You know, I was like, wow, you know, we just kind of like think about, hey, you know what, that's going in a hole somewhere.
Wow,
And
she's brilliant.
yeah, and I mean, even with what's happening in the Santa Clarita Valley, I'm sure you've heard about it with the actual landfill up there and how
Yes.
that turned into a whole lawsuit and all this other stuff.
Chiquita Canyon.
Yeah, Chiquita Canyon. I mean, like, that's basically where it would go, right? I mean, it would go into a hole in the ground like Chiquita Canyon, where it just gets kind of put away. I mean, like, I don't. It's kind of interesting to where you have the EPA, you have FEMA, and you trying to clean up the property. And now you're taking toxins and you're putting it back into the earth. I mean, like, we're doing that anyway. But I mean, it's an interesting time to be to live right now.
Yeah. Boy, you said that, man. Unbelievable. It's also interesting, exciting, dramatic. I mean, boy, there's some things that'll touch your senses like never before, man. Living in this world today, I'll tell you. Not that I lived in a world before, but if I watched TV, I watched Little House on the Prairie. I watched all those shows. Brady
love that
Bunch.
show.
It seemed like a different life back then than we have today, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Jesus Christ. Well, I don't know. There's so much to unpack here and talk about. And Dave, did you have any thoughts or questions about any of these things George and I were talking about?
And I think I find, George's input very encouraging and very insightful. And the one thing for me that is probably the largest concern is, and not to be a naysayer, is, even with the Woolsey fire, like what George just said, that was maybe 5 to 10% of the destruction. And so when you've got 15,000 structures, I'm starting to think, do I even have the wherewithal to comprehend the length of time for each step? And
right.
I guess we're going to find out. And, with all the best intentions, 15,000 structures, when you've got a whole community that's decimated in two separate communities, one in Eaton Canyon, the other one in, the Altadena, and then, of course, Pacific Palisades, I'm hopeful and just a little concerned about, just even before we can get to the shovel piece, what is it going to take to be able to clear the debris, get it out of there? I mean, I it's beyond my comprehension. Obviously, George is in a much better position to assimilate this because he's been through something like this before.
Right. Well, George and his daughter brought up a great question. Where are we going to put all these toxic materials and all this debris? Where's it going to go? And you mentioned Chiquita Canyon. I mean, there's one place, but there's got to be some other places like that. I mean, Chiquita Canyon's already got its problems where it's been fumigating people in the Santa Clarita Valley area and Castaic especially. And I'm not even quite sure what they got figured out on there. I know there are actually some residences in the area that are actually getting some sort of payment out of that, like some lawsuits going on, from just the smell. It's horrible. I mean, it's nauseating to be in some of these areas. It's really interesting. You can be a Castaic in one area, you don't smell it at all. You come over this way, maybe over a little mountain or something, or a little valley area, it's just hitting you like a ton of bricks,
Exactly.
So are there any other, besides Chiquita Canyon, any other potential areas that they'd be putting these deposits in?
Oh, there are many.
Many, okay.
Many. And we, at times, when we're doing demolition permits and to be able to get certain debris away, or whether it's if we're exceeding a certain amount of tonnage of grade, not tonnage, but cubic yards, when we're having to grade a property and we go over, depending on the tier one is 250 cubic yards, the other one is 1,000 cubic yards. We actually have to put together a haul route. And I think internally, various, government agencies are going to have to put together an actual route permit for themselves to be able to make sure that they're picking it up and they're taking it to a certain location. That's kind of like where you drive around and you see those signs that says, no vehicles over 3 tons or 6,000 pounds and stuff like that. They want to make sure that those heavy vehicles with all that debris don't end up crushing any of our existing infrastructure that's underground, of course.
That makes a lot of sense, George.
They're going to have to know exactly where that stuff is going before I don't think there's anything they could do to where they actually have to where they say, oh, well, we have this as a staging area. We're going to actually take everything, put it here temporarily, and then take it over someplace else. I think they're going to have to go from site to actual the dump, from the actual property
George,
to the dump site.
It's going to have to be, go ahead. It's going to have to be incredibly strategic, obviously. And there's going to have to be some bright people, managing and handling this whole thing and strategizing the whole process.
George, forgive me if thanks, Cash. George, forgive me if I missed this, but do you have any sense of an update for us and our listeners on in either the Palisades or the Altadena area? Has the debris removal and has that begun, or are they still assessing to get to that point, or is that already underway, or do you not really have a sense of that just yet?
From my current clients and people that I know, no one's come over to be able to actually do any of the debris removal. So they actually have to do an evaluation. And like on Wednesday, when I was with my clients and we were discussing, I mean, the amount of paperwork that that the FEMA has put together and the insurance companies have put together that that homeowners have to actually complete before any of this begins is kind of overwhelming. I mean, like ultimately, when we start filling out paperwork, and I know that all three of us are in the same industry where we're, okay, what's your name? Okay, George Avetisian. What's your address? What's your phone number? And you're kind of repeating the same exact thing from form to form. It's like, you would think they would at least attempt to streamline that process to where things are moving faster, because all of that information is repetitive. Oh, well, everything has to be completed. And I understand everything has to be completed. And just looking over the paperwork that we're with my clients, you're just looking at every single page, and every single page has the same exact information on it.
With no judgment, just objectively. So it's still in the pre-debris removal stage. In other words, debris removal it's still in the paperwork pre-debris removal stage.
100%. Yeah. From what I am experiencing right now, I haven't seen a single site being cleared. When we were driving around, I mean, we were on Sunset and looking at various properties and stuff like that. Even with that, there's no construction companies unless you're actually going to pay for it yourself. So this is an important point to kind of bring up, right? You can actually pay for your own property to be cleaned up. So you can actually have your own people come and clean the debris and do the evaluation, do the hazardous reports and all that stuff, and to be able to expedite the process for yourself. So ultimately, from what you're saying, as far as putting the, from shovel to the ground to to champagne, that construction process is, of course, after everything is cleared and we're ready to begin and permits are set, right? So as far as if everything goes streamlined and they can actually get everything through the way in which they're saying with their office in Westwood for LA City to be able to process all the permits, if you're not going too crazy, if you're not doing a basement, if you're staying above ground, if you're not changing the footprint of the building too much, if you're, potentially only doing the 110%, which is, I'm sure you guys have heard, going 10% above your existing, you could easily be able to do it in 18 months, but that is an extremely aggressive timeline, but it is possible. But ultimately, from my experience, even with FEMA being able to get out on site within the next month to be able to do their evaluation, they're still going to need the manpower to be able to clear out the properties.
Yeah.
And if they don't have the manpower to be able to clear out the properties, then we're looking at a few months before any of these properties get cleared. But again, understand that I want everybody to understand that you don't need to necessarily clear out your property to be able to start the permit process. Start the permit process as soon as possible.
ASAP, right?
Okay. Yeah. We have the internet. We have certain websites, whether it's Navigate LA or the assessor's office or Zima's or lacity.org. We have all these resources at our hands for us to be able to get a good amount of information regarding the property for us to get started doing the design process, even though nothing has been
Correct.
cleared off
It
the
would make
property.
sense that you only
Gotcha.
really
Okay.
need to make sure everything's cleared before you start with the shovel. So as long as everything's cleared prior to
Exactly.
you getting the shovel, there's things that could be happening simultaneously, right? Like while the debris is being cleared, you could be getting your
Right.
plans drawn, you could get your surveys done, getting your plans approved, etc. So there could be overlapping processes, and they're not mutually exclusive.
They're
Right.
not exclusive, and I highly, highly recommend that everybody get started as soon as possible, because by the time by the time the property is cleared, by the time people find out, well, how much is the insurance going to pay me, so I know what I'm building, at least you get your plans to a certain point and you actually submit them into the city and get your name on the on the actual list of plans getting checked. So what ends up happening, let's say, and you guys will have a lot more information on this than I will, but let's say we over design the house. We're like, hey, the insurance company is only going to pay this much, which affords us an X amount of square footage when we're trying to build it. But now we designed a 5,000 square foot house. The overall insurance is only paying this much, which could technically build a 4,000 square foot house. Just as long as you're in the actual queue and you're doing the plan check corrections, it's a lot less expensive for us to take the house, make it smaller to be able to fit within your budget relative to the insurance, rather than us going, hey, let's wait and find out what the insurance is going to pay first.
And then how
Does
does
that make
this tie
sense?
Yeah,
into
absolutely.
the other parameter that I've heard thrown around, that you can build up to 10% more than what? Maybe you can clarify a little bit on that. Like, let's use your example. Let's
Okay,
say you had a
so let's
4,000
say,
square foot house before.
yeah, so 4,000 square foot house, you're allowed to build 110%. So technically, you're allowed to build 4,400 square feet, right? So that's the 10% that you're allowed to go up and beyond. So what does that necessarily mean? So depending on when the project was permitted, there are certain things within the code, and this is where it starts to
Yeah,
get
I
extremely
can tell just
technical, and
by
I'm
the
going to
way you're
go a little bit
describing
nerdy
it,
on
it's
this.
not
But
easy to comprehend.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So let's say if a house was permitted back in 65, 63, before anything, before 78 or whatever you want to call it, right? So back then, the property was designed to where, hey, you know what? The square footage is of air conditioned space, right? Now we come into where I don't know if you guys have heard in LA City, we have the Masonization Ordinance, the Hillside Baseline Ordinance. So those ordinances kind of take other things into consideration. Besides the air conditioned space, we're talking about double height space, like anything above 14 feet counts twice. And then we get into like areas where you have covered patios. Those actually count towards some of that square footage if it's not within the kind of like the allowance that they give you, whether that be 200 square feet or more. Whether your garage is located in the front or it's located in the back, there's a whole portion of the code that says, hey, if your garage is located in the front, you can only exempt 200 square feet of it. But if it's located in the back, 400 square feet is exempt. So that 110%, even though people think that, hey, you know what, I have a 4,000 square foot house, I can build a 4,400 square foot house. That I would
It's
love to
not
say
that
that's going to
simple.
be the case in every single process. It's not that simple,
Yeah.
because we actually prepare maps relative to the square footage. What's the square footage of the interior? What's the square footage of the exterior? What's relative to anything that's 14 feet high? What's relative to the garage, covered patio, trellis, or a pergola, sunroom, whatever it is? All these are different classifications, which will give the people the opportunity to be able to get to that square footage. Now, the one thing that I haven't heard a lot of things about, which I'm really, really curious about, is the basement, right? So we have certain things that are kind of, again, I'm going to go kind of way over like what we need to discuss, but
We love it, George. We love it, man. Tell us, man. The inside stuff.
it kind of needs to be said. So we have a wildlife ordinance, which is attempting to kind of eliminate the allowance of basements relative to the floor area ratio. Again, floor area ratio is house relative to property size, right? So currently we can actually go ahead and design a basement, and that basement does not count towards that maximum floor area ratio. So let's say if we have a 10,000 square foot lot, if we have a 40% allowed house, that means 4,000 square feet of house. And so taking that 4,000 square feet of house, you could technically turn that into an 8,000 square foot house if you went down below grade, right? So if you have a 4,000 square foot house on the property and you have a 4,000 square foot
Because the
basement,
basement doesn't really
you have an
count as part of the
8,000.
living square footage.
Exactly. So I
Wow.
want to know what it's going to count towards with their allowances with 110%. First of all, second of all, as far as that whole ordinance, the wildlife ordinance, I don't know if that's going to be placed on pause. If that's what's going to happen with that, where they're are they going to actually allow us to be able to build the basements? Because ultimately, when you're again, I'm definitely referring more to the Pacific Palisades area than the Altadena, but square footage, price per square foot, you guys know, is a huge indicator for how much your house is going to be worth at the end of the day. So a lot of people are like, hey, that's kind of like not necessarily free square footage because it costs more to build below grade than it is above grade.
Yeah.
But ultimately, when you're sitting there and you're doing your calculations price per square foot, 8,000 square foot house is definitely going to sell more than a 4,000 square foot house,
Son of a gun.
even
Wow.
if it's a basement.
George, that is some amazing information. Hey, listen, everybody out there watching, we are digging deep here, bringing you some inside information that's just mind blowing to me. And we're talking real estate here today, real estate. This is the inside stuff right here. If you're finding some of this information useful, please do me a favor and subscribe to the channel, hit a like down there. We would definitely appreciate that so we can keep bringing you great, very informative guests on the show here. Okay.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
the amount of information that people like George have to share, there's two parts to it. One, it's so much that it may be hard to assimilate in one sitting. But beyond that, it's also a developing thing, right? Because there's information that George may have next week or the week after as this progresses that he could share in a subsequent video. So keep tuned as we go through this, because what we're sharing today isn't the last of what we're going to hear from George on the construction and that piece. It's an ongoing piece.
And we really appreciate George, and Dave, we appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge as well. George, I did have a question. We were speaking earlier, segueing into this for me. And Dave, you might want to touch on this too. This is kind of a question for both of you. You have a average sale price or average value of a home in the Pacific Palisades, 3.5 million, right? We know that some go way up above that and some come under, but the average middle price is 3.5 million in the Palisades. So all these houses burn down, right? We're not even talking about Malibu, but somebody's house burns down. And these are more affluent people, right? Okay. But their house burned down. They're still paying a mortgage, a lot of them, on these houses. A lot of the houses are owned outright, but there's a lot of them that have mortgages. They're still responsible for paying that mortgage. Now, they're also responsible for paying the property taxes. There could be some adjustments in those property taxes, right? Hopefully sooner than later, because now there's no home on there, but there's still land value. So they're still going to pay. They're still going to have to pay property taxes. They're going to have to pay their mortgage if they have that, and any other expenses that might incur, right? So,
Correct.
And now you're looking at 2.5 years, 18 months at the fastest, but that's probably not reality. Probably 2 to 2.5 years is going to be closer to reality. Maybe 3 years is what I've been hearing. And this is probably for the smaller size homes. Yes, George?
Correct.
Okay. We have a lot of larger structures down there too. And I've been hearing 5 years, 6 years. It just keeps going up. Depends on how big the house is and what's involved, what the detail is. So Dave, George, these people that lost their homes, they still have a mortgage. What do they do? George, do they come to you and they say, hey, I need to talk to a lender. I need to talk to a bank. I got to get financing to build a second home while I'm still paying on this home. How does that look, Dave? And George, what are you seeing too? What you guys could touch on that? That'd be great.
George, you go ahead, and then I'll offer anything from a financing perspective.
From what I've been hearing, there's people that are actually buying everything that's on the market, right? So we've heard about the overall house prices in Santa Monica, the lease prices in Santa Monica, Culver City, and the surrounding areas have kind of started to go up, and there's a whole price gouging, whatchamacallit, that Karen Bass was talking about, and how she's attempting to have a control on that. Part of it is that. Part of it is people are just, because they have the ability, they're going and they're buying um, there's another house, right? Ultimately, they're not going to lose money on it. Looking at the way the market is working, um, they're going to be able to buy another house, live in it while this one's being built, and then be able to sell that house afterwards and kind of move on. Now, this is where I think it's the bigger tragedy is when you have people that don't have the ability to be able to buy another house
Yeah.
or technically to be able to move to move or not to move but to be able to rent an apartment. There's people even in the Palisades that had those houses for years upon
Generational
years. They
wealth.
were completely paid off, generational wealth. They've had their property taxes are stuck at $130,000 valuation relative to anything else because it's never been refinanced. There's never been an addition. You know, it's there's going to be people that are just going to have to move out to the point to where they're either kind of moving out of the LA area, if not the state of California. I mean, like this is very prominent when it comes to like areas like Altadena because there is uh, a bunch of elderly people in that area that have lived there for years, and they've lost their house and they don't have anywhere to go except for potentially living with family and at the
Right.
immediate timeline, but necessarily to be able to take the time. I mean, like let's say if someone's at this point 80 some odd years old. And I don't mean that they don't have the ability, but I'm just saying somebody at 80 years old is at the point in their life where they're actually, they're retired, they're comfortable. They're not going to want to be able to go, hey, you know what? Okay, I know what the insurance company is going to pay me. I'm going to take that money and I'm going to rebuild. No, they're going to go, hey, you know what? Sell the property. I'm going to go and figure something else out. What I'm seeing is people are at all different aspects, but I think it's definitely more relative to the people in the Pacific Palisades area. They're buying another house or renting another house or potentially, leasing a condominium somewhere down in the same area and actually know that they're going to be there for a year, potentially 2 to 4 years, depending on how long it takes for them to rebuild, so that their kids are still in the same school district and that they still can take advantage of that aspect of it. But ultimately, we're seeing it all. We're seeing people staying and going to rebuild. We're seeing people just buying another house and people just renting for now, or potentially even considering moving away and moving completely outside of these neighborhoods where they're not going to be able to come in. And I'm going to kind of jump, and I talk a lot, so if I ever talk too much, just tell me to shut up.
No, we love it, George.
But ultimately, what I'm kind of worried about is what's going to happen when they rebuild these houses, right? Even at 110%, is the tax assessor going to evaluate the house at its original price, original numbers relative to the taxes that were paid
That's a great question.
before the house burnt down?
Yeah.
That's a
Great question,
huge,
George. That is
yeah,
a huge one. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, ultimately, like I said, there's people out there that are paying, property tax on something that's technically worth, let's say, $1 million, but overall tax rate on that particular property and when they purchased it is at $200,000, $300,000.
Right.
So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the tax assessor if the governor, whether it's Newsom, whether it's Karen Bass, or the mayor, whether they're going to be able to have any control over what happens with the assessor's office relative to the end product of those numbers that people have to pay at the city, at the county level and at the city level.
Yeah. Well, I think, in my opinion, they're going to have to lock them in at whatever that rate was before the fire. That's going to remain. They can't tax them on the new price, on the new valuation. In my opinion,
That's my opinion as well, and I hope we're right.
that'd be
That's
like double
this is
taxation.
a work in progress, but my understanding, and I'm having a firsthand experience with this, as I literally, the one and only client that I have that has had a total loss was in the Palisades, and she bought her home in 2000 ish for 1.2 million. It's worth about close to 4 now, and it was completely burned to the ground. She's almost 80 years old. And fortunately, we were able to preserve her loan. There is also going to be a certain protective period of time, and I don't know exactly what that is yet, where there will be no late payments, and if she cannot make the mortgage payments, no mortgage payments due, because she's currently.
Dave, what do you mean by preserve her loan? Could you talk about preserving the loan? What does that mean?
She had a 2.9% rate, which I got for her about 3 years ago. She's not going to lose that because she said, if I have to pay off this loan and lose that rate, I will not be able to borrow this money at 6.5%, 7%. Because
wow, now that's a whole nother can of worms that we just opened.
Preserve her rate at 2.9%. I work with corporate. We preserve that, so that's all in place. But my understanding is that when the property is rebuilt, her property taxes will remain what they were prior to the disaster. They're not going to be reevaluated at the higher price. But again, this is a work in progress. And because we are at this particular stage now, some people could argue, well, I need to know what my property taxes are going to be, because if they're going to get reassessed, maybe I'm just going to sell and move. Whereas just like I kept my loan, if I can keep my property tax basis, then yes, I can afford to stay here. So there's so many variables right now. But I will tell you, when an area is declared as a disaster area, especially for a total loss, there's protection against, if you don't make payments, there is protection against late fees and protection against credit reporting. And I believe what ends up happening, similar to what happened with COVID, and again, this is a work in progress, is the deferred interest that you don't pay just gets added onto the backside of the loan. And I believe in most cases, the terms of your loan will be preserved. But again, as I said last week, I strongly suggest that if you are in such a position where you've been relocated, you contact the servicer of your loan, whoever you make payments to, as this lady did with us, and say, hey, I've lost my home. I'm having to pay to rent a house somewhere. And, what options do I have? Because many people are not going to be able to pay the rent on the new house, which the insurance may or may not cover, depending on how long they're there. And also, on top of that, pay the mortgage on their existing home that they just lost. It's a work in progress. It's not an easy answer. It's not a simple one-stop shop. There are many aspects to this, and it's developing as we go. And needless to say, as more comes out of this, I will share it with you on further podcasts.
Every individual is going to have to be treated as bespoke, very custom tailored fit to everything going along the way here. And how about forbearance? I guess, are you seeing much of that happening at all yet?
Well, that ties into Dave? What we just said. In other words, if you have a forbearance, meaning forbearance is exactly where you don't have to make payments. It cannot be reported on your credit. It cannot be reported as late.
Okay.
Now, again, the payments don't just disappear. The interest portion only, because they can't add principal twice. So if you're not making payments, the interest portion only, just like COVID, can get tacked onto the backside of the loan. But again, how that's handled for each individual borrower is dependent on how your servicer is going to handle it. There are some national blanket rules that say you can't report them late, you can't charge them late fees. But again, we don't know how long that's going to be in place. So if you have a mortgage on your home and you've had a loss to the point where you've been relocated and you're having an additional expense at another place of residence, whether you're renting or whatever it is, reach out to your current servicer, whoever it is that's servicing your loan, tell them the situation, and get very specific answers in writing on how long can I afford to not make payments, how long is my credit going to be protected, how long am I going to be exempt from late fees, and last but not least, what happens to that additional interest, because you don't want it to have deferment for 3 months and then have to make a 4-month payment in the 4th month. If you're going to have deferment for 3 months,
gotcha.
You want to be able to then start making payments and have the additional money go onto the backside of the loan. And you have to ask them, how long do I get this deferment? Because I'm going to be making rent payments and living somewhere else for arguably 2 to 3 years, and in some cases longer.
Right. The stipulation, though, is that the area has to be deemed disaster.
Correct, which is most of LA County. There's a very large portion. FEMA
Yeah.
has declared disaster areas. I mean, I had many clients who were in escrow who were deemed in disaster, and their homes were not affected at all. So
Right. Okay.
it is almost impossible that you were affected by this fire and you're not going to be deemed in a disaster zone by FEMA.
Okay. Fair enough. Gotcha. So George, talking about and Dave talking about people that are moving out to other areas, either they're buying other properties or going with family or renting out properties or starting to kind of search around and kind of spread out because everybody wants to be as close to where they were living anyways and where their work is and their families are and where they've established themselves, right? That only makes sense. But sometimes that's just not available and you've got to start stretching out. You got to open up the market a little bit more, right?
Yeah.
And I think areas like some of these bedroom communities are going to pick up a lot of activity too, like Simi Valley, Thousand Oaks, Santa Clarita up there, and we are seeing a little bit of pickup up there with people that are coming that were displaced from the fires. They're actually looking for properties up there, whether it's going to be to rent or to buy. I think mostly buy though, honestly, because the renting thing, there was a lot of people gouging, if you will, or raising them up, even though they had a 10% cap put on that. Things still happen, right? And then because there was a cap and then there was hey, what's your credit look like? What kind of financing do you have here? Who's putting down a bigger deposit? Who's got 7 pets or who's got none? So a lot of these things come into the evaluation of who's going to get there besides just what the cost is going to be. And some of these people like 10%. And yes, a few realtors got caught with this because they were representing their clients. And that was a big no-no. I don't know if they got just a slap in the wrist or a slap in the face or a kick in the butt or what they got, or all three, but, or penalized with a fine. Boy, that's the worst thing, right? So I think some of that, all that above was happening on that, but so anyway, so my point is we are seeing more of this migration going out to some of these areas like that, and that's going to continue. And even where I'm at up like in Las Vegas now, of course, I'm licensed in California, Santa Clarita, and San Fernando Valley is my big market in LA, and up here in Las Vegas, where I'm at right now, talking to you from our office up here, and also Idaho, the Boise and surrounding areas up there, the Treasure Valley, Idaho, licensed in all 3 states and repping buyers and sellers in every one of them. So I'm also seeing push that we're going to get, and I've seen it. We've been in a restaurant where I saw Californians that were displaced. They're all eating dinner and they're not going and looking at houses and things, here in Vegas. So we're going to see movement up to Vegas. We're going to see movement up to Idaho. We had been for quite a while since COVID anyways, and then it slowed down quite a bit. And then I think we're seeing a little bit more of a pickup in that. And I'm reading some other graphs and stories about that as well to support that. So how much it will be, that's, we've got a ways to go before we can measure that. Right. But my question though is, so we know where people are heading to, but who's going to start coming in and buying a lot of these properties? As you said, George, some people are buying up all the Pacific Palisades already. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I mean, I don't want to go into like the whole conspiracy stuff, but like some people have said, there's companies like, BlackRock that are coming in. And they're going to be buying up a good amount of property, right? So I think if I was BlackRock, yeah, I would potentially go down there. I would buy up properties that people could not technically afford to be able to rebuild on, and then bring in some type of a high-end builder to be able to come in and just rubber stamp a whole bunch of houses. Because at the end of the day, it's still an extremely desirable area. People want to live in the Palisades. People want to be able to be close to the ocean. And relatively to all the different school districts and all the private schools and everything that is in the privileged area of Pacific Palisades, which is a beautiful area. So I think we're going to see some of that. I think they're going to probably want to keep it under wraps as much as possible. I think they're going to potentially not want the exposure or the kind of anyone knowing what's going on. But I think from what I hear, almost like close to 50% of the people are not going to stay. That's a huge number.
That's huge. Yeah.
And what was the number of houses that were destroyed in the Palisades? Let's say, relative to anything else, it's closer to like 7,000 or 8,000 houses that were destroyed, right? I mean, like, can you imagine like 4,000 homes just saying goodbye
Yeah.
and
Unbelievable.
leaving? And I mean, like,
Unbelievable.
that's a pretty powerful statement. I don't know.
George,
I
you can't
mean,
blame the people though. I mean, it's like it's going to take so
Correct.
long to rebuild, to clean up, to rebuild. And then what if you're one of the first houses to get rebuilt? You move in and then you're going to watch all the construction go on for how many more years?
yep.
Watching all the dust and the tractors and the builders. I mean, who wants that? Have you ever bought in brand new construction anywhere? Maybe it was a track or a custom home, but you're watching all these other homes get built. So, hey, maybe we didn't talk a lot about politics, sex, drugs, and rock and roll tonight, but we definitely brought you some great information about the inside scoop, all things real estate. We're talking to Mr. George Avetisian, getting into some of the design and development aspects of what's going on in LA and the pickup and what's going on for the rebuild. And then also Mr. Dave D'Souza talking about some of the lending aspects and him sharing his perspectives as well. I mean, it was dynamite, power-packed information on here. If you want more cash in your life, hit the subscribe button down below here so we could keep bringing you some great content. And if you would like to talk to Dave about lending, Dave D'Souza or George Avetisian about anything with design or development at all, please reach out to me. Call me, text me, email me, DM me, throw a stone, or check the links below. We're going to have them all on here for you so you can get hold of these super powerful, super intelligent gentlemen anytime that you can. So until then, I'm going to say good night, and we'll see you on the next show.
Thank you, Cash. Thank you, George. And thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you guys
gentlemen.
very much.
Thank you, Amy.